A warm welcome to everybody to this talk organised by Cambridge for Europe. My name is Michael Clegg. I'm the Secretary of the group Cambridge for Europe. I've also got here this evening Paul Brown, who's our chair, who will be helping with some of the questions. Just to say that we're recording this session and that recording will be put out on our social media channels. So if you're uncomfortable being seen, then do turn your camera off. That might help a little bit with any bandwidth issues anyway. So if you do fancy turning your camera off, that would be great. We've muted everybody, and we'd be grateful if you could stay muted in order to avoid too many noises off. Before I introduce our speaker for tonight, perhaps I could just talk a little bit about the format that we're going to follow. So Terry will be speaking for about sort of 10-15 minutes, and then we'll turn to questions for the majority of the evening session. As usual, if you could put any questions you have in the chat, then Paul or I will read them out for Terry to answer and group if appropriate. It would help if you could label any questions you have very clearly as a question, so we can tell what's the question and filter out the general comment that you might also be making in the chat. And by all means, begin posting those questions whilst Terry is speaking, and then we'll have some ready for when we turn to questions. We've got a few announcements that we'd like to make at the end of the meeting, in particular about events in Cambridge over the coming week, to mark the anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, both to memorialise the horrors of the past 12 months and to act as a call for action for the year ahead. Okay, so I'd like to thank Terry enormously for coming. Terry Reintke has been a member of the Greens European Free Alliance group in the European Parliament since 2014. She's a campaigner for the rights of LGBT people, a feminist, and she stands against the exploitation of European workers. She's called out the opponents of democracy, whether genocidal tyrants in Russia or far-right trolls closer to home. Many of you will be familiar with Terry as a friend of pro-Europeans, Democrats and progressives in the UK and across Europe, being one of those who has pressed for the ability of Wales and Scotland to rejoin the Erasmus+ programme. And I'm sure that many of you, like me, will have heard Terry's inspirational speech, the Rejoin rally in Parliament Square last autumn. And so it gives me enormous pleasure to hand over to Terry. Terry, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Michael, and good evening to all of you. I'm very happy to be here. You know, I have to maybe start by an apology, because actually the last time I was in the UK, where I was going from Scotland down to London, I was planning to come to Cambridge as well, and it didn't work in the end. So I'm still quite sad about that. And I hope that next time when I come, I can actually come to Cambridge and then hopefully meet many of you in person as well. And maybe I'm going to start with something that is not directly Brexit related, but that I think probably concerns us all at the moment. And that is indeed the question of how the war in Ukraine is developing, and how the war in Ukraine, this full-scale invasion of Russia and this attack on democracy, on freedom in Europe by Russia, has shaped our societies and has shaped the world. And I'm absolutely convinced that the fact that we see such a brutal attack on a European democratic country has actually made cooperation between the democracies in Europe and across the world even more important. So I really think that the past months have shown how important it is that we stand up against autocracy and that we work together. You know, what Vladimir Putin was basically expecting and what he was trying to do was to divide democracies, and basically the opposite has happened. Both the European Union, but also the UK have shown a very clear response to this invasion. And I think that this is something that can actually give us hope that also in the future we are going to work closer together on foreign and security related issues. You know that the trade and cooperation agreement that the UK and the EU after Brexit have found is not including this policy field as much as certainly a lot of people in the European Union would have liked. So I hope that in this changing geopolitical situation, we can find more entry points to work together, because as I said, I think it will be of great importance that we work together politically much closer, and especially the war in Ukraine has shown that. But obviously, I've heard that there are a lot of people in Cambridge who have been working on support and solidarity for Ukraine. I think it should also be mentioned that Ukraine is already now, after a very short period of time, a candidate to the European Union. It has been granted candidate status last year, and we are proceeding with preparing, also starting the negotiations. I mean, you have probably all heard it. There is no fast track procedure to joining the European Union. But of course, especially in this very difficult situation that Ukraine is in right now, and with the effort that we see that the country is putting into starting the negotiations, I think things are very likely going to move much quicker than in a lot of other cases has been the situation in the past. So I'm very hopeful that as soon as possible, we can fully welcome Ukraine to the European family. And some of my colleagues have actually spoken about, wouldn't it be a good moment when Ukraine then joins the European Union, that we could maybe also see progress on moving closer to the United Kingdom again. But I think one of the things that the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, and then, as you know, the number of sanctions packages that we have seen towards Russia has also shown is that we have made a lot of mistakes in the past with regards to Russia. And I especially have to speak on behalf of the country that I was born in, and that I'm elected in right now, and that is Germany. Because over the past years, we have become very dependent on Russia, especially on Russian gas, but also on other Russian fossils. And this has made us weaker in responding to this invasion. And I think that the last month, of course, really in high speed, we have done everything possible to get more independent, but we shouldn't have been in this weak situation to start with. So I think it's also a lesson learned that when it comes to energy, but also when it comes to the green transformation, we can very clearly see that it is not only a matter of fighting against the climate emergency, that we are phasing out of coal, that we are phasing out of gas and nuclear, but that it is also to do with security concerns in Europe. And this is why it's so important that as soon as possible, we become a climate neutral continent. And for that, you've probably also heard, we are taking important steps in the European Union right now. We are now going to have a big investment package, Repower EU, in order to move from fossil to renewable energy. But we are also going to have a push, especially in response to the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, to really boost green industry. I come from a very industrial area in Germany, from the Ruhr area, and there the talk is about how to, as soon as possible, produce green steel, how we can get the industry on a green path. And for that also, the cooperation with the UK will be absolutely crucial, because we know that when we look at the global scale, and when we look at not only the dependencies on Russia, but also, for example, on China, Europe will have to work together much more closely in order to not be that dependent and reliant on mostly autocratic countries in the world anymore. And I was asked to speak a little bit about politics in Germany as well, and maybe also Germany's role in the European Union. And I can tell you, I mean, the Greens are in government in Germany now for a while already. We are in government together with the Social Democrats and the Liberals. And there are probably not a lot of things that these three parties in the coalition agree on. But I can tell you one thing, and that's not only the three parties in the coalition, but basically all Democrats in Germany agree on. And that is that Brexit was a really big mistake. So across the democratic political landscape, there is a lot of unity on this. And I think that maybe what is interesting to you, or what is important to mention, that in the German political debate, rather than trying to, have a more distant role in the European Union. The political debate is much rather going into how we can integrate more strongly in the EU now with the situation in Ukraine, but also with the challenges of the green transformation ahead of us. I think there is a very clear understanding that we need to work together on a European level in order to meet these challenges. But also, for example, and I think looking at the discussions and also at the voting behavior that we could see before the referendum in 2016 in the UK, what will be important is how we can more closely work together on social issues, because we can see that especially where people feel most deprived, where you have the highest divide between the rich and the poor, also the criticism of the European Union in not delivering on giving people the opportunities to make ends meet are the strongest. And I think in the past, there was also a point to this. I believe we have not done enough in order to protect workers' rights in the European Union, to fight for social justice in the European Union. And there we will need to take steps forward. And very recently, we have actually had a very positive development where a scheme was introduced to secure minimum wages all across the European Union, which I think will be absolutely crucial, not only to have more social cohesion in the EU, but also to work against very dangerous developments, very anti-democratic, dangerous developments, these tendencies that we are seeing across the EU. I was also asked to say a little bit about the current negotiations, because probably all of you have heard the phrase "Get Brexit Done." Boris Johnson gave this out as his slogan. Brexit is far from being done. And also, even if there is now going to be an agreement found on the Northern Ireland Protocol, I can tell you Brexit is still going to be a problem for many, many years to come. We will have to see discussions around where the TCA, where the withdrawal agreement are still not, where we still see that there are blank spots, where the UK and the EU will have to negotiate and see how to find solutions to very practical problems. But of course, the most pressing issue, as you all know, is the Northern Ireland Protocol. I was actually quite optimistic in the last weeks that we had seen progress. We could hear from the Commission that on some issues, maybe solutions had been found. And I think that would be absolutely important, not only for Northern Ireland, but for the whole of the UK, that we can move on with this. The Northern Ireland Protocol is an integral part of the withdrawal agreement. It can work if both sides show readiness for that. I think the European Commission has made a very far-reaching proposal to make it work. And I hope that in the next days or in the next weeks, we can actually see that an agreement can be found. Maybe just to say, obviously, the EU side would have liked to avoid the situation to start with. It was always clear from the beginning that especially for Northern Ireland and for the Good Friday Agreement, Brexit would pose a lot of problems. All these problems came as predicted. The EU side has really tried to move in the direction of the UK government in order to find solutions on the ground. I hope that these solutions will be found. I think that they can be found if there is willingness. And then I hope that we can move ahead and not have the situation heat up even more. And lastly, what I wanted to say, because I'm being asked this question quite a lot, and I have also already answered it quite a lot of times, but I'm happy to do it again, that of course, if there was a sustainable offer from the side of the UK to rejoin the European Union, what I experience everywhere here in Brussels, but also in Berlin and other capitals in the European Union, we would be more than open to have the UK rejoin the European Union. Obviously, there would be a process for that. It doesn't only happen overnight, but I think that there is a very, very wide majority of people in the EU who see Brexit as a mistake, both for the UK and most of all for the UK, but also as for the European Union as a whole. So I'm absolutely convinced that the door remains open. However, one word of caution: we can see already when there is going to be more divergence. So when, for example, with different bills, EU regulation is being removed, standards are being removed, obviously then also a process to move closer together again will be more difficult. So I think there is a lot of openness, but of course, as accession to the European Union is a merit-based process, we would have to safeguard that would be possible. And if you ask me about what would be the first thing that I would do in order to get on that path again, you have mentioned that I, together with a lot of colleagues from the European Parliament, had suggested, because both the governments in Wales and in Scotland were actually open for this idea, for Wales and Scotland to stay in Erasmus or rejoin Erasmus. I think the most actually sensible step to do is for the whole of the UK to rejoin Erasmus. It's a program that I think has brought a lot of benefit, not only to me personally, because I had the chance to study in Edinburgh for 1 year in my Erasmus time, but to many millions of people in the European Union and beyond. And I really hope that there is maybe also going to be a change of mind in the UK government on this, and these benefits will be more appreciated. And then the United Kingdom as a whole could come back to the program. Maybe I'm going to leave it here, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you, Terry, for that comprehensive overview, and I think I'd describe it as a guardedly optimistic conclusion there, maybe. So we've got loads of questions flooding in. So perhaps I could pitch one in first, and then Paul, perhaps you could pick up with some others. So I thought this was the first question. I'm now realizing I think it's the second, but perhaps I could go with this one and potentially we can go backwards. So I've got a question from Anthony Carpen here. Anthony says, hi Terry, Anthony here in Cambridge. How, as the EU and the working relationship between EU member states has changed as a result of negotiating as one versus the UK over Brexit, and having to deal with multiple crises such as climate, migration, and the war in Ukraine? And I think this summarises Anthony's question. Really, it's simply, how different is it to the EU as it was in 2015?
That's a very interesting question, and if I may, maybe I start by telling you an anecdote. I had friends over this weekend and we went to the House of European History. If you ever come to Brussels, I can only recommend it. It's a museum of European history, basically, that is next to the European Parliament, and the people who are going to the European Parliament to see European democracy in action, so to say, can then also go to the House of European History to see how it all started and how the European Union as an integration project came about. And one of the things that I found really striking, and maybe it's something, you know, that can make you wonder, or it can even be something bad, but I think it also has a positive side to it, that every time that Europe or the European Union was facing different forms of crises, this was basically the starting point of seeing that to find solution to these crises, we should work together more closely. So a lot of the integration steps were actually taken after problems came about, after there was something that wasn't working and there were some external shocks. And then the European countries thought, okay, how can we deal with these problems? And if we work together, we can actually deal with them in a better way. Sorry, and in a way, and I know that this might sound a little cynical to you right now, but I think there is a real effect like this. Brexit has done something similar, because on the one hand, we can see that the support rates across the European Union by citizens have gone massively up over the past 10 years, and especially after Brexit happened, because people really see the added value of what the European Union is doing and how it actually has a positive effect on their life. But also, as you were referring to the member states, I think this working together and seeing how difficult it can be for a country, even as big as the UK, to deal with these crises on their own in a way. I mean, we are still working closely together, but not in the context of the European Union anymore, has really helped to move forward with a lot of other issues. And maybe to give you one example, during or after, in between the Corona pandemic hit very hard, we have moved ahead with the Next Generation EU, which is a massive investment fund to help the member states to deal with the impact and the needs for recovery and resilience for the future, and to give this money and to make it available to our member states. And I think there has been a learning process of a lot of people seeing that exactly these kind of moments when you are facing crisis together are the moments when you see the most how much cooperation is useful to all of us. And especially when we look at the economic development in the UK right now, which I'm 100% not happy about. I'm never happy about people losing their jobs or, you know, the NHS being in crisis or anything like that. But I think a lot of people are realizing that the fact that the European Union countries were working together, had support from the Next Generation EU, and really stabilized the economies, and that this is also something that is going to be helpful in the future, no matter what kind of crisis we are going to face. So I think actually, you know, ironically and also a little bit cynically, I don't want to sound that way, but Brexit and the way that it has shown a lot of the strength of the European Union has actually made the EU much stronger than it was before.
Great, thank you very much, Terry, for that question. We have a few questions which, sorry to answer, I mean, we have a few questions which I'd like to bundle up together, actually, about all on the theme of the UK rejoining the EU and prospects for that. So the first question, if I can scroll up, was from, hang on here, it was from Mike Cashman, who's you've been very clear about the EU welcome for rejoining the UK. Do you want to comment at all on the likely conditions for the UK rejoin, i.e. the Copenhagen criteria? I'll scroll down to the next, another question here, which is from Mike Lloyd, which is 3 questions. Given that the EU needs to deal with multiple issues, multiple crises such as Ukraine, general institutional reform, I guess the fallout from COVID would fit in there as well. Does the EU have the bandwidth to actually deal with the reaccession of the UK? What would be the likely timescale, and what, if anything, would need to change in the UK and in the EU for member states to feel it would be worthwhile for the UK to rejoin? And the third person, finally, on this theme, is from Roger Cracknell, who's speaking as an activist for both the Rejoin EU party and also as a member of Get PR Done, Make Votes Matter councils for PR, and saying how much of an issue would not having proportional representation be in the UK in terms of reapplying for membership? And I suppose that speaks to what you said about sustainable offer for membership, because as we all know, parties in the UK have won general elections on less than 35% of the vote. So yeah, that's the bundle for you.
Thanks a lot. I will try to answer everything. Maybe first of all, I mean, as Mike rightfully pointed out, there are certain criteria, and as I already hinted to, these criteria will be applied to any country that would want to join the European Union, also those who would want to rejoin. So indeed, these criteria would have to be met. I just want to do a reality check. I mean, right now, still today, the UK meets most of these criteria. I mean, you had a situation where the full EU acquis was applied in the UK. And yes, the more we diverge, the more difficult it will become. But there has never been a situation before where a country had already applied the full acquis and then joined on the basis of this. So I think there will be a check and there will be negotiations, but I think they would be much, much easier than in all the other cases of countries that we have seen in the past. So I'm actually quite hopeful. I don't want to give you a clear timeline how long it would take. As I said, it will be faster if there is less divergence, and it will take longer if there is more divergence. But I think that it would be something that is very, very doable. I think the precondition, and indeed, Paul, when I said sustainable, this is what I mean. What would be needed is a clear intention to join the European Union and to stay in the European Union. Because I can tell you one thing that, and this is not something that, you know, politicians care about, and, you know, it's like there is a political game at this. But if I speak to my parents or my family, you know, they are all super happy to have the UK rejoin, but all of them then say, okay, but then 2 years later, they cannot, you know, change their minds again and leave again, because there was a very messy Brexit negotiation phase, and we are very happy to do that again. And I can very clearly see that there would be capacity, and there would be readiness also to put energy into making that possible. But then it needs to be for a longer period of time than, you know, just a couple of years. And so I think that this is something that is very much shared. When I look at the public discourse and also at the latest surveys, at least that I saw, there is a growing, well, maybe not majority, but at least a growing number of people that would actually support the UK rejoining the European Union. I have recently seen a survey where I think only in 3 constituencies or something like this, people are still believing that Brexit was a good idea, and most constituencies, the people are actually convinced that Brexit has been a mistake and that they would like to rejoin the European Union. So this is what I mean indeed with a sustainable offer. And I think on PR, I mean, you know, I come from a country where we have a proportional representation, or we have this personalized proportional voting system. As I said, I think from a democracy point of view, it is a better electoral system, but we also have countries inside of the EU that have different forms of majority voting system, like, for example, in France. So I think introducing PR is not per se a precondition to join the European Union. However, I think a lot of the problems that we have seen in the UK, especially ahead of the referendum, a lot of the issues that we can see, I think, with changing political positioning of parties are related to the fact that there is this electoral system. Because for me, it is quite striking that still today, when you have a majority of people in the UK that actually say, maybe Brexit wasn't such a good idea and we should look at how we can move back closer to the European Union, we do not see any of the 2 big parties sort of picking that up, which I find a very interesting development. I think in a country like, for example, in Germany, that would be different. And because there is proportional representation, you would then have other parties growing and picking up these topics if people really care about them. So no, it's no precondition to have a proportional voting system to join the European Union, of course not. But I think some of the questions relating to democracy are certainly in the UK, also because of an electoral system, which I see in some ways actually not maybe giving the flexibility or the openness in the political discussion that other electoral systems give.
Thank you, Terry. That was a very comprehensive answer to that set of questions. And a really interesting one too. I just want to ask one, perhaps then a shorter question, and it's one of our earlier questions, but I didn't want it to get lost. So this is from Colin Gordon. And Colin is noting that he's noting how during the Brexit debate there was a weaponization by some of the more cynical Brexiteer politicians of issues around the treatment of refugees coming to the UK. And Colin's asking what prospects there might be for an alliance of civil society organisations in the UK and those in Europe interested in more humane policy towards refugees and asylum seekers.
Look, I'm not going to lie to you. The whole question of refugees and asylum is also, I think, has become a very problematic political discussion across Europe. We do not only see these very inhumane, racist asylum policies being implemented in the UK. We also see a trend towards that more and more in the European Union, which I think makes it even more important that it is exactly as I think Colin was the name, suggested, civil society and all those politicians and citizens who are very firmly defending the right to asylum should work together much closer. And I think that also here the solution actually lies in Europe. Because if we had, for example, resettlement schemes, if we had relocation schemes that would take away the pressure and the full responsibility from the countries at the external borders of the European Union, we could actually find solutions. And there could be minimum standards of reception of asylum seekers. They could be distributed across the whole continent of Europe and then have access to shelter. I think the situation that we are now seeing at the external borders, for example, in Greece, but also in other countries, is largely related to that unreadiness of other member states to actually take responsibility here. So yes, I think we should work together much more closely and really demand the right to asylum to be protected, but also for very practical solutions to be found. And because it is absolutely true that the situation that we are seeing in Greece and other countries at the external borders is not sustainable and is not something that we can accept, but that we have to solve. So I hope that we can actually have, again, a different trend, because what I see at the moment, both in the UK, but also in a lot of EU member states, is very, very concerning. And I think it's going to end with a further militarization of external borders. And this cannot be the answer to the issues that we are currently facing.
Thank you, Terry. Yeah, I think it's some of the lesson of the Ukraine war was the way that people welcomed the Ukrainian refugees across so much of Europe, including here in the UK and in my home country of Ireland. But I think that generosity, I think we need to find a way to extend it even further. I think, given the the crisis that the world is facing, we can't just isolate Europe. I think that's a very strong point.
Paul, can I still make one point? Because I think the reference that you make to the refugees from Ukraine is absolutely crucial, because the difference between refugees from Ukraine and all the others was that for the refugees from Ukraine, the temporary protection directive was activated, which meant that people had a certain level of security. They knew that if they were coming to the European Union, they would have certain rights. They would have the possibility, to get housing, to get support to put their children into school. And we can see that for them, actually finding, finding jobs, becoming part of the society, very quickly integrating was much easier than for all of those asylum seekers. And I know a lot of cases who basically for months and months, sometimes for years, are in a waiting period because they do not get clear responses to their asylum claims. And this is basically what we are doing. We are putting people into a loop, very long loops very often. And this is a barrier to then integrate and to find jobs and to have your children, to go to school. They can also go to school. But I think that we can see with the refugees from Ukraine, if you do it in a good way, if you give people a certain level of security, it is much easier for them to actually find their way around and to integrate into society. So I think there is a lot of learning to do for us, also when it comes to all the other people who are seeking asylum in the European Union. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, it's a very, very good point, actually. Thanks for making it. Next question is probably a shorter one from Jane Reed. Would the UK rejoining the EU mean taking on the euro as a currency?
Well, as I said, negotiations would have to be had. But yes, as a general rule, that would be the starting point of the negotiations. And I know that there are a lot of people in the UK who would probably not be happy about that. But if you look at the treaties, I mean, the UK had an exception. But if now countries join, this is what is expected of them. I think there is also a very reasonable argument. But as I said, there would be negotiations. And then we would have to see how these negotiations end.
Thanks, Terry. I'm going to ask another slightly UK-focused question. I hope that's okay. But David Eldridge has asked, what do you make of Keir Starmer? If the polls are right, he's very likely to be the next UK Prime Minister, and he's already met Chancellor Scholz as well as President Zelensky. But his policy on Brexit and the EU is, as I'm sure most people on here will agree, very disappointing. So I think it's just any comment on that statement, really, and what do you make of Keir Starmer?
Well, as I said before, I find it quite interesting that Labour, as the big opposition party, is not having a different direction when it comes to Brexit, but it is how it is. What I can say is that if Labour was to win the next general election and Keir Starmer was to become Prime Minister, what I'm at least quite optimistic about is that the negotiations on all the issues, related to the TCA, but also any kind of closer cooperation would be much easier. Because I mean, especially Boris Johnson, but also the other Tory prime ministers have broken so much trust. They have made reasonable negotiations, a trustworthy relationship so much more difficult. That I actually hope if a person like Keir Starmer or somebody from another party, or also somebody from the Tories who would have a different sort of attitude towards the European Union, this would already make a lot of things much easier. And I hope that this will be the case. And because, as I said, I don't think that rejoining or well, the shift in policy from the UK side is going to happen overnight, but it will, from my point of view, be much easier if there are first certain steps taken, and that would, of course, be, again, a more trusting and a deeper political relationship between the UK government and the European Union. Because one thing is absolutely clear. I know that this is a lot in tabloids in the UK, but there is no sense of taking revenge or Schadenfreude, or the feeling of now they need to suffer or anything like this in the capitals or in Brussels in the European Union towards the UK. I think there is a lot of regret about that the UK decided to leave the European Union, but other than that, people want the UK and the EU to cooperate as closely as possible. Again, we are living in changing times. We have autocratic tendencies all over the world. And how should we not see that working together as democracies on one continent that share values like democracy, like rule of law, should not work together as closely as possible? You cannot explain this to anyone. So to me, it's really about moving closer together, and from the starting point of that, building trust again, and then seeing how we can, work together in the future on a sustainable, trusting, joint, in a joint union, let's call it that.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, step by step, I think, is the catchphrase. Got a question from John Oakes. It's actually related to Ukraine and the Russian invasion. It's, why is perpetual neutrality for Ukraine not the most durable solution to this problem? And do you agree that offering the Ukraine membership of the European Union will simply confirm the understandable threat of hostile encirclements that Putin claims to feel, and which he can use to justify his belligerent stance to the rest of the world? Discuss.
Well, I mean, the official answer to that is there was an agreement, and the Ukraine is a sovereign country, and they can decide themselves who they want to be associated with. But if you would make this argument regarding NATO, I could maybe even get it. But the European Union is a political union that is based on, as I said, joint values. And I think that there is a wish for countries like Ukraine, but now also Georgia, Moldova, the countries in the Western Balkans to join the European Union because they want to be part of the single market, because they want people to move around freely in the European Union, is, I think, a very, very understandable wish. and it is something that shouldn't be denied to millions of people across Europe just because Vladimir Putin feels threatened by democracy. Because if you use that logic, then shouldn't you also say, should Ukraine really be a functioning democracy? Because at the end of the day, what Vladimir Putin is feeling threatened by is, not in the first instance the fact that Ukraine is closely working with the EU, that we have an association agreement, or that they are now trying to become a member of the European Union. It is the fact that Ukraine is striving to be a stable liberal democracy. And this is, I think, the right not only of the people in Ukraine to live in a democracy, but it is actually what we should support, what we should encourage. So for me, it is clear that if Ukraine, and I mean, we are not offering the membership, Ukraine is asking to become a member. Ukraine is a European country, and if they can clearly show that they want to, follow EU values, that they want to be part of the European Union and follow EU law, then I'm more than ready and hopeful actually to have them join the European Union.
Thanks very much, Terry. Thanks very much. And I couldn't agree with you more. At the regular vigil for Ukraine, which we hold on Saturdays, 2 o'clock on King's Parade on Saturdays in Cambridge last Saturday, then Andrei, one of our Ukrainian colleagues, taught us all how to say Ukraine is European in Ukrainian. And I wish I could repeat that now, but unfortunately I'm a poor linguist. Terry, I think I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question on my own behalf, if I may, slightly cheekily. But I wanted to ask something about the rule of law in Europe and in the EU. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, one of the issues that we in Cambridge for Europe were thinking about, kind of trying to look beyond the Brexit and rejoin question that tends to obsess us slightly. But one of the issues we were looking at was the question of the effectiveness of the rule of law in the EU, and the way that Poland and Hungary in particular were challenging the rule of law in the EU. And I think undoubtedly that's a question that's been complicated by events in Ukraine. I mean, there's been one positive there, in as much as the illiberal alliance between Poland and Hungary that seemed to be developing has perhaps been fractured. But that, my sense is that focus on questions of the rule of law in the EU has also perhaps been lost slightly. And I just wondered what your own thoughts were on how the EU can continue to take forward the agenda of ensuring that the rule of law applies to all its members and that there isn't illiberal backsliding.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, speaking about people attacking rule of law and democracy, it's not only something that we can see externally, but it is something that is happening inside of the European Union. And you have now given the examples of Poland and Hungary, and there, I mean, we have people in government who are very openly attacking rule of law and fundamental rights, but we have political tendencies and political movements all across Europe and all across the world, actually, that are trying that. So yes, there is a very big threat there. What maybe I would give a different nuance is whether this is not as present as it used to be in the EU, because yes, you're right. I think it's spoken of less, especially because the focus has been very much on Ukraine, how the response to the brutal aggression is going to be. But I think in terms of what has happened, actually quite a lot of things have happened over the past months. So, for example, for the first time, the rule of law conditionality, where funds are going to be frozen for Hungary in this case, has been activated, which is something, and I can tell you, I was the rapporteur for the Justice and Home Affairs Committee. The European Parliament had been pushing for many, many years. So I think that this is a good step. I mean, I wish it was a step we wouldn't have to take, but it is a good step in showing a clear stance on defending rule of law. And also when it comes to the recovery and resilience funds that I was just speaking about, both in the case of Hungary, but also in the case of Poland, they are still blocked, especially exactly because of rule of law concerns. So I think in terms of in terms of speaking about it, yes, we have been speaking about it less, but in terms of doing something, the Commission has been much more active than many years before. And also just recently, the Commission published that they are now going to take legal action against the Constitutional Court in Poland, or against the government in Poland, but regarding the case of the Constitutional Tribunal, because as some of you might know, the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland has basically challenged the primacy of EU law, and not only in one case. And this is obviously something that we cannot accept. I mean, if you're part of a club, you have to either accept the rules and also follow the rules, or it's going to get difficult, you know, to have the club function. So also there we have seen more activity in terms of an infringement procedure. So a lot of work still has to be done, but I think we can see that the Commission is actually going into a right direction, and is taking more also proactive action to protect the rule of law than in the past. So yes, there's still a lot to do, but I think that there is now more readiness to actually act on this.
Thank you, Terry. Actually, I've got a couple of questions. Well, they weren't questions. For Helen Macmillan, who's joining us from Edinburgh, and Risha Dushande, please forgive me if I've pronounced that incorrectly, from Stamford, have both posted comments about the Erasmus Plus scheme and the benefits it's brought to that they've experienced through it. I'm just wondering if the UK was going to planning to rejoin Erasmus Plus, how quickly and how easy could that happen?
I think actually that could happen quite quickly, because we have, I mean, there is a legal basis, there is a program now, a regulation that actually has changed. And I think one thing that has always been a criticism of the Erasmus program is that in the past it has very often mostly benefited young people who are in higher education, so for example university students, and the current regulation actually now gives more possibility also to young people who are doing vocational trainings, for example, who are doing internships. I think that's a very important change that has been done, and I think that this rejoining could be done very quickly. However, you know that there is one precondition, and that the Commission has always made very clear, that then also the UK would have to pay the financial contribution to the program, which I think also makes a lot of sense if you want to be part of a program that you also financially contribute. But I mean, we have non-EU countries that are part of the Erasmus program, and you know, there has never been an issue with that. So I think it could be done quite quickly. And actually, when we wrote the letter to Ursula von der Leyen about Wales and Scotland rejoining the Erasmus program, she was more reluctant on Wales and Scotland joining, because so far we don't have a legal base for regions in a country joining the program. But she said that if the UK as a country, as a whole, wanted to rejoin the program, that would be absolutely possible. And I believe it would then also be possible very fast.
Thanks. I think it's probably worth saying that people have studied, analysed the Erasmus Plus scheme, have found that it's actually also been a financial net benefit to the UK because of the money that brings into UK universities, despite obviously the UK having to contribute to the cost of the scheme as well, like any other country. But I think I'll hand over to Michael. I think he had a question lined up.
Yes, thanks, Paul. Actually, before I ask the question that I'm going to ask you, Terry, I just want to note Phil. Jean's sort of question come comment, which is to say, have you seen, oops, sorry, it's just moved for me. Have you seen the Brexit float in the Düsseldorf Carnival today? Jacques Tilly excelled again today with Miss Brexit 2023, showing what most Europeans think about Brexit. So I'm not sure if you've seen that, but it sounded entertaining. I wanted to ask a more substantial question from Daniel Beck. I think if I can find it, Daniel, if I can't, I'm going to have to paraphrase it from my memory. So I think what Daniel was asking was, as we've begun to develop increasing military coordination across Europe in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, does that imply changes to European government and indeed more, or European governance, I should say, and more centralized European government as a result of that kind of defense coordination?
Well, maybe I'm going to start with the float in the Düsseldorf parade. I'm not in Düsseldorf, unfortunately. You know, it's my capital. I come from North Rhine-Westphalia, so but I have seen pictures of it, and I really like Jacques Tilly. Maybe some of you know that actually he also made the Star of European Unity, which we are going to display in the European Parliament. Hopefully, we are going to get the exhibition grounds in May. To show that, you know, despite the fact that Brexit happened, the UK and the European Union still, well, have a lot more in common than what divides us. So yes, I have seen that. And I also think that the response that you could see from the people around it, you know, what I'm saying about people thinking that Brexit was not a smart idea, is also present in the Düsseldorf Carnival, and also the sentiment that people would want the UK to rejoin the European Union is very clear, especially if you go to a city like Düsseldorf, that, you know, the Rhineland and the whole area that has always been very Anglophile and felt very close to the UK. So I think especially in that area, people really regret what happened. Now, when it comes to the defense cooperation, yes, I think we are going to see a discussion about how also the European Union can play a stronger role there. You know, we also in the treaties, we have some references to defense cooperation. In a lot of ways, I think it hasn't been spelled out what this really means. So there have been more meta vague discussions about what this cooperation should and could look like. We have this European Peace Facility that has also been activated now. But I think there is a wish, especially from Eastern and Central European countries, to work on this more. At the same time, and I'm going to give you two main arguments where I'm still skeptical or where I think more discussion is needed. The first one is that, as you know, some member states of the European Union, now it's Ireland, Austria, then you have Sweden and Finland that are going to join NATO, but Ireland and Austria that are neutral or that are, you know, not NATO members. So I think that for them, the whole question of how close the European Union is going to work together on defense and how exactly this can look like is certainly going to be maybe slightly differentiated. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. And the second point, and I think this is again a little bit also the German background speaking out of me, I'm not against closer cooperation also on military matters. But for me, the problem right now is that the parliament has very little to say in all of this. And I think if we were to move forward, the European Parliament would have to have a much stronger role, because I come from a country where anything that has to do with military and defense has a very strong foundation into the representation coming from the parliament on all of these matters. And I think that this is something from the German past, but also from the European past, that makes a lot of sense. So if we were to move ahead, we would need much more powers given to the European Parliament to actually have a role in these considerations, to have much stronger oversight, for example, to have more possibilities to ask questions about how exactly this cooperation looks like, what kind of measures are going to be taken. So I think, yes, it's moving into that direction, but there's still open questions that I think really deserve discussion.
Thanks, Terry. Can I get in with another cheeky quick question of my own as a follow-up to that, actually, which is, we've just talked about governance in relationship to defence cooperation, but I wonder, do you think there are governance reforms needed at the EU level to really properly tackle the challenges of the climate emergency?
Absolutely. I mean, okay, let me say we have already seen that in the past months or years now, a lot of steps have been taken, but I think that if we really want to move ahead with certain issues, for example, stronger cooperation on energy matters. I mean, if you look at the European continent, you can clearly see, you know, there is the north where you can have a lot of wind energy, you have the maritime areas, and then you have the south where you have a lot of solar energy. And there are going to be moments when we will basically need to have energy coming from the north to the south and vice versa. So if we really want to, in a fast way, in an effective way, tackle the climate emergency, we need, and we will need electrification for that. So we will need much more electricity. I think the potential that we have in the, you know, diverse abilities we could have in different parts of Europe has to be used. And I think for that, working closer together, we always said that we need a renewable energy grid in Europe, that we basically need, you know, we had the coal and steel union, we had the nuclear union, and basically now we need a renewable energy union, so that all of these things can actually be expanded and boosted much faster. And for that, we will need to have certain issues decided in a quicker way than they are decided now. And having said that, I'm not saying that every single issue that has to do with energy production will have to be decided in Brussels or on a European level. There are issues that are much better decided on a local level or on a regional or on a national level. But we need to have a stronger coordination. And in a lot of issues, we also need to move from unanimity to qualified voting. Because if we always have to wait for every single member state to say yes to something, I mean, we have this whole discussion on taxation. We are not going to move as fast as we would have to really make a difference when it comes to climate, but also when it comes to other issues. So yes, I think we need to have an institutional reform in the European Union.
Great, thank you very much, Terry. I think Michael beat me to it there with his question. I had it all lined up, but thank you for answering it in such so well. Actually, has covered a lot there. I'm just looking at the questions. We've got one from Peter Burke here. Looking at again, turning back to the UK. Are initiatives like the retained EU law bill and the approaches to the Trans-Pacific Partnership merely a sign of extreme desperation by the next sideshow now that rejoining has finally started to be discussed by serious people? Is it just calculated to make rejoining more difficult? Are these things likely to threaten the survival of the trade and cooperation agreement? I think obviously we've got general election coming probably in about next 18 months in the UK. Are people on the way out sowing salt in the fields?
I think I didn't fully understand the question. I think there were too many idiomatic terms that maybe, I'm not a native speaker, maybe you have noticed. Can you rephrase that, Paul? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's just basically there's a bill going through Parliament at the moment called the Retained EU Law Bill, which seeks to have essentially a cut-off of the end of this year where all retained EU law bill will automatically be got rid of unless a minister decides otherwise. It's in the House of Lords at the moment. And do you think the moves like that are just are intended to make it more difficult for the UK to rejoin the EU?
I know what the retain bill is trying to do. I think just the salty lands that you were referring to, that was an image I didn't know.
Yeah, I think it's a classical thing from from the Roman era, where they destroy farmland by covering it in salt.
Yeah. Okay. No, yes, I think indeed. I mean, I said this before that, now the more the UK is going to diverge from EU legislation, and I think that's basically the aim of scrapping all EU regulation, and which also, to be frank, even if you are a convinced Brexiteer, I think it's not a very smart move. But anyway, I think that yes, there is a political agenda behind it, to basically to move the UK further away from the EU, and with that make it more difficult to rejoin. However, I still think that the case has to be made in a lot of questions, like when we speak about environmental standards, when we speak about social standards, you know, none of this was introduced because the UK was supposed to make the EU happy. These laws were adopted together with UK ministers around the table and with the UK parliamentarians taking the decisions because of a reason. I mean, having minimum standards for workers, having minimum standards for environmental protection, it's not something to please Brussels, it is something to protect citizens from, you know, carcinogens or from exploitation on the labor market. So I think to make this argument, and we were actually speaking about it with some people from the European movement, why these laws that, you know, were coming from the European level, why they were actually beneficial for citizens in the UK, and to explain this to people will be very important then also to defend these standards, or to defend these laws, but also to make a point that, you know, a lot of things that were said during the referendum about, you know, what Brussels is trying to impose on us, it was basically made up, and it was very often, you know, spinned in a way to make the EU look like this bureaucratic monster. But actually, a lot of these rules make a lot of sense because they make people's lives better. So I think that there is an opportunity also to make a very strong pro-European argument in the discussion on exactly that.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think actually one thing that struck me, I saw a list of the very few laws, EU laws, which weren't backed by the UK government in qualified majority voting, which were in the last decade. And looking through the list, it was clear that a lot of them, no matter where people stand on Brexit, they would probably agree with what the EU decided in terms of carcinogens, a lot of them related to the environment, actually. And so I think there is an element of maybe the if people knew that, maybe, or it's something that it's part of the argument that actually the EU had our backs on this when our own government was wanting to expose us to lower standards. But anyway, I think.
Thanks, Paul. I was going to say, Terry, we've already taken slightly more than the hour that you promised us from you. So are you okay to take perhaps one more question? Great. So I've got another question from Mike Cashman here. Would you see benefits for the UK and the EU in cooperating on green issues?
Absolutely. And maybe to tell you what I'm going to do this week, tomorrow I'm going to visit ThyssenKrupp, which is one of the biggest steel producers in Europe. And they need a lot of hydrogen, green hydrogen, to also in the future produce steel. And then on Wednesday, I'm going to Scotland to speak to people in Scotland because they want to produce green hydrogen. And the question is how the green hydrogen that is then going to be produced in Scotland will come back to the beautiful city of Duisburg where I live, so that it can produce steel that we will all need, for example, for expanding rail travel and so on and so forth. So absolutely, Mike, I think it will be crucial that we work very closely together on green issues. I mean, I made one example now, there are a million more examples. I think that when we look at the challenge that is ahead of us when it comes to fighting climate change, we will need all of Europe and basically all of the world to fight together. So I think it's one of the points where we can clearly see that cooperation is the better logic to follow when we look at the world and what is coming for us. So not only there, but also in a lot of other fields, we should work together more closely.
Thanks very much. Paul, you were off mute then. I wasn't sure if that was because you wanted to say something?
No, I just thought if we had a few in the announcements about the Ukraine events, maybe if we're
absolutely. So thanks, Terry. Before I sort of finish with formal thanks to Terry, as I said at the opening, perhaps we could make a couple of announcements of forthcoming events. I'll say a couple of things, and then Paul, if I leave anything out, or if you wanted to mention the London events too, then perhaps you could come in on that. So I just wanted to mention from the Cambridge for Europe perspective, just a date for your diaries is the 19th of April, which will be our annual general meeting. And then in terms of the events in Cambridge to mark the anniversary of the Russian war of aggression on Ukraine, this Friday coming at 7 o'clock in the evening, there'll be a candlelit vigil on King's Parade. So 7 o'clock on Friday is the candlelit vigil. Then on Saturday, there will be a march that will start at the War Memorial that's at the back of the Botanic Gardens and the road up to the station. So at the War Memorial, there will be the start of a march, which will finish again in King's Parade. So that's at 2 o'clock on Saturday. And then on 4 o'clock on Sunday in Great St Mary's Church in the centre of town, there will be a prayer for Ukraine. Paul, did you want to add in on the London events or anything I've missed there?
Yeah, I will actually just say that I've added Facebook links for those Cambridge for Ukraine events into the chat. So if anybody wants to browse through that, we'll give you a bit of time to do that before we close the meeting. In London, there will be an event run by the Support Ukraine, your London Euromaidan group, which has been holding weekly protests, demonstrations in Downing Street. They're working with a whole lot of other Ukraine support groups in London. They are having a vigil followed by a march, which will start at 4 p.m. on Friday, the 24th, at the Saint Vladimir statue on Holland Park Avenue, and that will go on till I think about 4 o'clock vigil, 5 o'clock march to the embassy of the Russian Federation, 5:30 rally at the embassy of the Russian Federation, presumably finishing around 6:30 or 7 or thereabouts. So if anybody in London wants to go along, that would be a good event to go for. I think there is also an event in Trafalgar Square on the 23rd, the Thursday, the 23rd, at 7 o'clock. I think it's organised by the Ukrainian embassy on the, I can't find the details of that right now, but if you're in London, you can look that up as well. So I've put the vigil in London into the chat as well there. And thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. And thanks for putting that in the chat. That's really helpful. So finally, just again to thank Terry, I can see messages coming through in the chat there saying that that's been an inspirational and heart-lifting for those of us in the UK who can sometimes feel a little downhearted about our political situation. That has been a heart-lifting talk. So thank you very, very much for joining us. That's been great. I think I can say that on behalf of everybody. Thank you.
Can I still say one thing? Because I mean, I have been working on Brexit now for many years, and I can only say that for me, what you have been doing, and you know, the pro-European movement in the UK is still such an inspiration, and the work that you have put into this, and that you keep going. Despite the many barriers that are put in your way, I really think that this shows that Europeans working together, Europeans fighting together for a common cause is going to move mountains, and I hope that you will keep going, and then at some point I will come to Cambridge after the UK has rejoined the European Union, and then we can celebrate European unity together. So thank you so much, and for this interesting discussion. And I hope that, one day I will meet all of you in person.
Thanks, Terry. That's really, really great to hear. And you'll always be welcome in Cambridge. Thank you.